So have you ever looked at the world and wondered, is all this global inequality just a random accident? Or is the entire system actually designed to keep some countries on top and others at the bottom? Well, today we're diving into some neo-Marxist theories that tackle that exact question. Who is really pulling the strings of the global economy? Let's get into it.
And this is really the core question, isn't it? When we see this huge gap between the world's richest and poorest nations, are we looking at an unfortunate but natural outcome of history? Or is it a fundamental built-in feature of how our world economy is structured? This is the puzzle that the thinkers we're talking about today are trying to solve. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll go a little beyond classic Marxism just to set the stage. Then, we're going to jump into the big ideas from two major thinkers, Robert Cox and Immanuel Wallerstein. We'll break down Wallerstein's world system, and then, at the end, we'll bring it all together and compare these two really powerful ways of seeing the world.
Okay, so to really get what the neo in neo-Marxism is all about, we have to take a quick look back at the classic ideas they were building on, or, in some cases, pushing back against.
The traditional Marxist view really boils down to this. Economics is the foundation of everything. It's the base. And the big conflict that drives history is between the social classes, the people who own the factories and the people who work in them. Everything else, especially politics, is just the superstructure that gets built on top of that economic reality.
So how do we get from that pretty straightforward idea to something a bit more complex for our modern world? Well, our first guide here is Robert Cox, a really important thinker who adds some brand new, crucial layers to this whole analysis.
Cox's whole framework really kicks off with this big idea he calls historical structures. The best way to think about it is like a snapshot of a specific time in history. It's defined by a unique mix of different forces that are all bumping up against and shaping each other.
So, what are these forces? Cox says there are three key ingredients in the recipe for any historical era. First, you've got material capabilities. That's the raw stuff, right? Technology, production, resources. Then you have ideas. The shared beliefs and values that tell people what all that material stuff is for. And finally, you have institutions, the rules, the laws, the big organizations like the UN or the World Bank that kind of lock those ideas into place.
And what's really fascinating is how Cox shows these three forces interacting on three different levels, with each one building on the last. It all starts at the ground level with social forces, basically how capitalism works on a day-to-day basis. That in turn shapes the forms of state because governments have to react and adapt to that economic system. And those two things together create the world orders that dictate how countries deal with each other.
And you can see this idea perfectly in his own words right here. Cox is basically arguing that in our globalized world, the system itself keeps states in line. They're all pressured to make competitiveness their number one priority, which means they have to avoid doing anything that might get in the way of that goal. It's a massive check on what a government can actually do.
Okay, so that's Cox's framework of these dynamic, interacting forces. But another huge thinker, Immanuel Wallerstein, came at this from a totally different angle. He didn't just see a set of forces. He saw a single, huge, interconnected system with a very, very long history. For Wallerstein, you just can't understand today's world without rewinding the clock way back, all the way back to what he calls the long 16th century. He argues that our modern capitalist world economy didn't just pop up during the Industrial Revolution. Nope. He says it was born right here, between 1450 and 1640, when Europe started expanding across the globe.
And his most famous idea is that this world system is structured like a three-level pyramid. At the very top, you have the core countries. They're the ones doing all the advanced high-profit stuff, like finance and tech. Way down at the bottom, you have the periphery. They're providing the raw materials and cheap labor. And then, stuck in the middle, you have the semi-periphery, which is this really important buffer zone with a mix of both.
So, the big question is, how does this global pyramid actually stay up? What's the engine that keeps the core at the top and the periphery at the bottom? Well, for Wallerstein, it all comes down to how wealth gets moved around the system. The whole system is powered by something Wallerstein calls unequal exchange, and it's pretty much what it sounds like, a massive, systematic transfer of wealth. The periphery provides all this low-wage labor and low-profit raw materials to the core. The core then uses that to create high-profit manufactured goods, which it sells back to the periphery. And this whole cycle is held in place because core states are powerful and periphery states are kept weak. This quote from Wallerstein just nails it. He's saying, look, capitalism isn't just about a factory owner taking extra profit from a single worker. It's bigger than that. It's about the entire core of the world systematically pulling wealth and surplus value from the entire world economy.
But this raises a really good question, right? Why doesn't the entire periphery just band together and overthrow the core? Well, this is where that middle layer, the semi-periphery, plays its most crucial part. It's a political shock absorber. By giving a few countries a little bit of hope that they might be able to climb the ladder, it prevents a unified opposition from ever forming. It keeps the whole structure from collapsing.
Okay, so we've looked at Cox's world of interacting forces and Wallerstein's rigid three-tiered system. Now let's kind of put them side by side to see how they both give us a powerful lens for understanding the global economy.
You know, to really get what makes Wallerstein's views so different, it's helpful to compare him to a more traditional thinker, like the neo-realist Kenneth Waltz. Waltz sees a world driven by states competing for military and political power, but Wallerstein just flips that script completely. For him, the real driver is the history of capitalism. Economics comes first, and it shapes politics, not the other way around.
So what's the simplest way to remember the difference between our two main guys? Well, Wallerstein sees a really rigid economic structure, that global pyramid, where your spot is pretty much locked in. Cox, on the other hand, sees things as much more fluid, more dynamic. For him, the world is always being reshaped by this constant push and pull between technology, ideas, and institutions. It's really structure versus process.
So after all that, what are the big takeaways from this whole neo-Marxist approach? Well, it's really a lens that forces us to see the global economy not as some fair and neutral marketplace, but as a system fundamentally built on inequality. It tells us you can't separate politics from economics. The people with the economic power are almost always the ones with the political power. And ultimately, it paints a picture of capitalism as this engine that develops unevenly and is always lurching from one crisis to the next.
And let's end on this one last, really provocative thought from Wallerstein. He predicted that the biggest threat to global capitalism wouldn't be its failures, but its incredible success. That once the system has expanded to every corner of the globe and there are no new peripheries left to pull in, its constant need for more profit will trigger crises that could actually lead to its own transformation. So, is the system, just by succeeding, planting the seeds of its own end? Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for joining me.